Welcome back everyone to another Mythfall Devlog. If you're new to the channel, I'm building a browser-based bullet hell MMO from scratch in Golang and documenting the process along the way. It's been quite a while since the last update, so let me try to hop in and explain to you guys all the stuff that has changed. As you no doubt can tell from the title, a streamer actually played Mythfall, so very exciting stuff, very exciting times, and a lot has changed. And a lot will continue to change. Back in the world of Mythfall, one thing that I added was a new jeweler shop. I wanted to expand on the number of rings in the game, so I added a bunch of new rings that can be crafted, and there's a lot more to the upgrade tree for crafting your rings. Actually, two little crafters, and I built this cool little like display case for these little figures. I thought that was like this is like my best artwork I've ever done, so I'm pretty proud of that. Anyways, they have the same shop, but there's two of them. In addition to that, I also added a wizard's tower, just like in RuneScape. I was very inspired. But anyways, he adds the new staff crafting progression. So there's a few new staves now that you can build up to and craft with. So that's now added to the game. I'll probably add a little bit more to this because it's a little bit bare right now, but I think it's a good starting point. So I added a lot of ability books, one per dungeon, which I think really increases like the amount of counterplay there is in the game. So I'm happy with that. So for example, this one gives you bleed for 4 seconds and then gives you another status effect called the bloodletting ritual for 6 seconds. And you can basically apply that. You start taking damage over time, and then you also increase your lifesteal chance. So that's kind of the trade-off there. So that's kind of a fun one, I think, because you might be able to regen some health, but you're also losing health over time. This one, because it does damage to the recipients, I opted to make it only buff the player who casted it, so you can't actually like hurt other players with this. So because I think that would just kind of mess people up if you started getting killed by other people who are causing you to start bleeding. So I opted to make this one buff cell, but most of them, if they don't negatively impact players, they're only a positive, then I just let them apply to everybody basically. Another change you might notice is I added an HP bar below the player, so it's a little bit easier to tell what your health's currently at. There's also a dash stamina bar below that, so as you can see I can dash around. I also added items that can impact your number of dashes. So as you can tell, these are the artificer's goggles. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but basically they give you +1 dash. So you have 1 dash, you equip it, you get 2 dashes. That lets you dash a little bit more frequently, but they still regen at the same amount of time. That's a separate stat that regenerates them. So it's kind of cool. I can adjust this as well. And then it also displays for the player. They can tell what's going on. Another change that I added that's kind of a quality of life for dungeons was previously when you'd walk into a dungeon, everybody would attack at the same exact time. But I changed it so that mobs kind of see what other mobs are doing and they prevent each other from attacking all at the same frame. Because before you'd walk in and everyone would attack you on the same exact tick. But now they kind of offset themselves. So if someone's already attacking, the other mobs won't attack as well. And that makes it a little bit more fun because you don't walk in into a full like spawn of bullets, you know? And it gives you a little bit more of a chance to see what's going on. I also added a few new dungeons and items along with it. We can go through the items first, or we'll go dungeon by dungeon. I added the Chamber of the Awakened dungeon. That now drops the Bone Dagger, the Bone Scythe, the Mask of the Loyal, and the Awakened Heart, which got disappeared at the very last second, which is used to craft some of those items. So you can go in the Chamber of the Awakened. I had some nice lighting effects with the little candles, and there's monsters in here that you can fight against, and there's a final boss that you encounter. I won't walk too far into it because it'll spoil the fun. Also, I have tons to talk about, so that's that dungeon. Then I added another one called the Scorpion Pit, and this one drops in the desert. This is kind of like a common mob dungeon that drops in the desert. It's got a bunch of scorpions in it, and there's obviously a scorpion boss at the very end. You can run around and fight these guys, and they all have their own little abilities, and they chase you down and stuff like that. But I'm pretty underleveled, so I would probably die here. So I'll just leave. Over time, I've kind of been learning a lot of different things that I like to do for boss fights. I kind of like made a little list here of things that I think are important for boss fights. And I'm still learning over time because I'm still developing this. And if you've played the early bosses, you've seen that they're way more basic than the later on bosses. So I think I'm getting better at it, which I'm happy with. But a few things, I think interesting bullet patterns are important. I think it's important for players to have a clear path that they can walk through. Because if there's just tons of bullets and you can't dodge them at all, then that's obviously not fun. There's no like skill that can be found because you just like, well, let me try to minimize the number of hits I have. Abilities kind of add counterplay to that. Like if you have a guard ability where it spawns a barrier around you, then that could be used to help you in situations like that. Then that ends up causing that ability to be kind of a must-have for that dungeon. So it's kind of a little bit of a trade-off there. But I think interesting bullet patterns where they look visually cool and then they also have a clear path that you walk through. I think that those are important things. Sub-objectives I think are important to have inside of boss fights. So like, for example, example, in the Scorpion Pit fight, I added the Scorpion will drop scorpion eggs that then hatch into like the smaller scorpions. So then you have this trade-off where it's like you have an objective to kill the scorpion eggs, but you also need to kill the boss. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there of what you spend your time on. So I think stuff like that adds a little bit more like dynamic situations in these boss fights when the player has to make some decision on like what they want to do. So I think that makes them a little bit more interesting. But I think adding the status effects to boss fights can make them more interesting as well, because it ends up being a projectile that's more critical to dodge. So it's like having different levels of projectiles where some are not as important to dodge than others, I think adds some more dynamicness to dungeon fights. Also, something I learned, which was a bad habit from my initial boss designs, was that the initial bosses I'd make like just a cyclical kind of loop of what they would do, but that ends up like being very obvious to detect that it's a pattern that's just it's walking through. Even if you like randomize the attack that it does, just watching it do the same exact things over and over and over again isn't very fun. So I think having phases inside of your fight is also super important. Like once the players progress a certain amount of the HP bar, nowadays I'll try to transition the fight to something new. So have some like divider, or even if it loops back to the same original starting of the fight, like having some divider where some event happens, that kind of like makes it a little bit more challenging, at least for at least temporarily, I think is important. And then so I think having small bursts of chaos is important. I think that if the fight is just calm all the way through, like even if it's like precisely calm where it's just like there's tons of bullets, you have to like precisely dodge them, I think that can be a little bit tedious rather than fun. So there needs to be some kind of like unpredictability that happens. But all that said, I'm still experimenting. There's still lots of bosses to design, but I'm at least happy that I'm getting a little bit better at it. I think the later bosses that I've designed have been a lot more fun than the earlier on ones. So I might go back and redo some of the fights just to make them a little bit, like clean them up a little bit and add a little bit more of the things I mentioned to them so they're a little bit more fun for the early game players. So the next thing we'll talk about is that a streamer played Mythfall. This is a streamer who his name's Sebchoof. He plays Realm of the Mad God mostly, I think, but I think he also plays a few other Realm likes and other indie games like that. So it's cool to see him at least discover and find Mythfall, and he even decided to play it in one of his streams. So very exciting. He even made a YouTube video about it. Yellow is the current number of players logged into the game or playing the game, and then green is the average number of players, like the 24-hour trailing average. As you can tell, there's a few times when it spiked up a lot. I think he played here, and a lot of people logged in just to play like with him while he was streaming it. I think he played at these two events, and then I think he made a YouTube video around this point where a lot more people started playing. But this is kind of the pattern I think you see with a lot of games that kind of get like visibility spikes. There'll be a spike of players, then it kind of tapers off over time. I think the game was not in the best place for like driving new players to stay around because there's a lot of balance issues, which I'll talk about. But just for now, yeah, the player spiked a lot. So we got up to it's like 76 people, like 76, 80 people. This one went to 105. I think or 94, I guess, but or it might be average out a little bit there, but I think it got to like 105. The top peak was, and the server started to slow down quite a bit. So I ended up adding a player cap where anything above 85, I just block people from logging in. So that's kind of the player cap right now. It's just a $12 server, so it can't really support tons and tons of players. But I think in the future, when the game's a little bit further along, I'll purchase a more expensive server and hopefully host more players on it. But this is all we can host right now is like 85 people, which I'm pretty happy with, I think, for $12 a month. So yeah, but yeah, the average kind of has increased a lot. Or before he played, the average was maybe like 5 or so. And then today, which is maybe a month after he first played it, or maybe even more than a month. No, about a month. Yeah. We're kind of an average about 10 or so, and it'll spike up to like 20 or something like that. And then go down to, I don't know, low numbers, like 3 or 4 or 5. So it's fun to see like more and more people play. I think that this is a common thing you see when you see games like spike up. Like if you're ever looking at an MMO, there's always some launch and then it launches and it spikes and it goes back down. So there's kind of this like spike and then it tapers off sort of trend that happens by default for games. So I don't know if we've hit the floor of this like the game being streamed sort of thing that happened to like I don't know if we've hit the floor of people losing interest in Mythfall. But I think the game's getting better over time. So I'm hoping to have that. Well, there'll be more and more events like this. Like for example, eventually the game will launch on Steam and more and more people will find it at different points in time. So I think this is a common trend to have. So even though it is a little bit scary to like, oh, you get a bunch of attention and then it like kind of fades away very, very quickly, or not super quickly because it's been about a month, but fades away. But some people stick around at the end of all of that and they want to see the game progress. they want to see stuff get added to the game, or they like the game. So that stuff's very rewarding and exciting to see. There were a lot of balance issues, and there were a lot of early game progression issues that I discovered from watching him play. So it was good to uncover those, and I think that will ultimately help make the game better for new players. So I'm happy about that. But yeah, it was cool to see a streamer play the game. I learned a ton from watching him play. It's very rare that you get, or at least it's been rare for me to watch other people play, just because no one's really streamed it. And that's kind of the only, I don't really have like a big playtesting team or anything like that. So yeah, it's just kind of me playing it, or me playing it with people. But it's interesting to watch other people play it. I was able to pick up on a lot of like subtle things where things clearly didn't make sense to him. And since then, a few other people have streamed it as well. So yeah, it's been cool to see and learn from watching people play. I think that's a really important piece of feedback to have. So I'd highly recommend that for anybody making a game, to watch people play your game, to see like what they do, even if they don't talk about it. But streamers are even more helpful because they will talk about it. So I got some good feedback from him, and yeah, but we'll hop into that now. Oh yeah, and then in terms of people making accounts, this is the current account tracker. Every time it dips, it's just because that's like a deployment that happened for the game. So yeah, before he played, that was maybe, what is this? Before he played was like around here. So we were like approaching 1K. I think we were just hitting like 1K or so. And then he played and we quickly spiked up to like 2K. Now we're sitting up at almost 3,000 player accounts, which is like very exciting. I'm sure it'll be more over time. But so one of the big things I noticed was that a lot of the fights became trivial, because what would happen is, and this is probably something that happens in all these sorts of games, but because it's a bullet hell, bullets need to get like splatted when they hit things. So when there's a lot of people, other people are deflecting bullets from you. So everyone ends up just standing in one pack and nobody takes damage because people in front of them are always the ones blocking the bullets. So that was something that I fixed. So I ended up making pretty much every single projectile pierces now infinitely. So if it ever hits another player, it just doesn't splat on them. It'll just pierce and it'll hit you. But if it does hit you, I do decide to splat it so that it doesn't hit you twice. That was a feedback I got, that people weren't happy that they get hit twice by the same projectile. So I think that that's much improved. Then there's a few abilities that used to be in the game that I had to disable or rework. One such ability was the barrier ability. So there used to be an ability which would just tank every single bullet that hit it. And it would last for maybe 3 seconds or something, which is pretty short, but I ended up reworking that to decrease it quite a bit, or the amount of duration that it sits for has been decreased quite a bit. So it's a little bit less spammable. Not that spells are very spammable in Mythfall anyways, but I'll maybe have to rework it again in the future. I'm not sure. I might have to add an HP bar to it or something like that, so it doesn't tank like infinite bullets in fights. But we'll see. The same thing with healing, where if everybody has a healing spell, they can kind of just constantly spam it on each other and heal each other infinitely to kind of just protect everybody. So everyone just gets infinite healing just because so many people have a healing spell. That was kind of the most popular spell for a while. Another feedback I got was that rooms felt too small, and this probably comes from the fact that I was testing the game solo. But basically, when the rooms are really small, the bullets end up being more and more unpredictable. So if you're with a group of people, you don't know who the monster is going to aim at. So if the monster aims at a different player that's nearby you, it can end up causing you to like get shot by a projectile that's aimed for them. So it makes the fights much more unpredictable. So having a bigger room helps balance that out a little bit, because in small rooms, there's not as much room to dodge. So you're kind of at the mercy of your allies to like hopefully not run towards you. But in bigger rooms, it's a little bit safer. You can kind of stay away from people, and hopefully bullets won't come at you. Or if they do, you have more time to dodge them. Another thing I added was opacity mode. One of the very first fights I did with a lot of people, I kind of realized that this was going to be a problem, but I eventually implemented it. Basically, I just added a little toggle slider. Basically, I added this little toggle slider where you can kind of increment or decrement the number of people you expect to, or the number of people you want to have before opacity mode turns on. But you basically turn it up or down, and then inside the fight, basically what will happen is it basically just makes it a high visibility mode so that everybody's turned a little bit transparent, so you can't see people quite as much. You can't see their projectiles as much. Or I think it doesn't even spawn their projectiles. It doesn't spawn their damage numbers, stuff like that. So it's a little bit more like, it's like you're 1v1ing the boss, but you can kind of see where other players are. I might add an additional slider to that as well, so you can scale up and down the like level of opacity for other players to decide how much of them you want to see. But this helps a lot with the bigger grouped fights, like fighting Elevarg and things like that. The next thing that I learned was that dungeons in groups are way easier than dungeons by yourself. So it is kind of hard for me to balance dungeons around me playing by myself. It's kind of a tough balance because I do want dungeons to be soloable, but at the same time, I want them to be not trivial when they're done inside of a group of players. So I have to make sure that it is like someone by themselves could reasonably figure out and go and do this dungeon. Maybe not every dungeon, but at least most of the core dungeons need to be done that way. But yeah, but when there's a group of players, especially with everyone having abilities and being able to buff each other and helping out and stuff like that, it just makes dungeons a lot more easy. There's less people, there's less bullets hitting you, there's more bullets hitting other people, stuff like that. So I've tried to, when I balance dungeons, I typically try to make them harder than I think they should be, just because I expect it to become easier when there's groups of players. There's health scaling, so if there's more players inside of the room, the health of the monsters increases kind of linearly with that, and it's kind of scaled up. So that does help make them tankier, but it doesn't help make them more deadly, I guess. So I have a few other ideas in the future of what I might implement to help fix this as well. That's kind of the solution right now. But also when I play with people, it helps me to understand like how the dungeon plays with a group. So I try to always play every dungeon that I drop with a group of people just to see like how it feels, and then rebalance it based off of that. The next thing that was a big issue was loot tables dropping things. So how I originally concepted the loot table dropping equation was I would basically just say you needed to do 10% of the total damage dealt to the monster to be able to get or total damage dealt to the boss to be able to get a boss drop. But obviously that doesn't scale well, because if you have more than 10 people, now there's guaranteed at least one person isn't going to get it, or at least two people won't get a drop. So it doesn't work out very well. It's a tough balance because I reworked it once, and that caused a lot of people to start leeching. Like I lowered the requirements a lot. So then what would happen is people would just, everyone would wait to the very end, or one person would go through and clear the entire dungeon, and everyone would just follow them one room behind, so they wouldn't be actually in the next dungeon. So that would reduce the health scaling. But then when they went to the fight, everyone would just show up at the last second to try to get a drop from that boss. So I ended up with doing 3 requirements. There's basically the damage tracked, or the damage dealt inside of the dungeon, like to the mobs on the way to the boss, and there's the damage dealt to the final boss inside of the dungeon, and then there's the initial point when you deal damage to the boss. So there's kind of like a threshold for each of these that you have to meet to be able to be eligible for a drop. And if you are eligible for a drop, then you're guaranteed kind of the same loot roll as everybody else. I might end up doing a tiered system, and maybe I'll do like solo dungeons will give you more loot, things like that. Right now, I'd rather just incentivize group play rather than solo play. So that's kind of how it's turned out. And that's been pretty balanced. I haven't seen as much leeching at least, so that's a little bit better. But it is kind of a hard threshold to pick, because the higher I make each threshold, the harder it is for newer players to get items, but the less likely people are to leech items. So I'm trying to find that, and I kind of tweak it a little bit every single patch to try to find the right spot. When I originally was designing loot tables, I tried to make the loot scarce so that people would feel like they earned it or whatever. I kind of changed tunes a little bit. I think I'd rather the game be easier to get loot earlier on and then harder to get loot later on. So the early game, the loot's been improved quite a lot, because originally I'd kind of made it scarce all the way through. So you kind of had to like fight a little bit to get all the loot. But what I think I'd rather have is I'd rather have the early game. I'd rather have it be very easy for people to like quickly progress into the early game and start doing more and more interesting content. I think my original fear was that people would like just progress so quickly and then like finish the game and then just be done with it. But what I've found is that I think people will find like more interesting ways of playing the game, and I think I want to lean into that a little bit more. So like people will do like restricted accounts and things like that to see how far they can get without having like certain tools available to them. I think that's kind of a cool concept. It kind of reminds me of like the Iron Man concept in like RuneScape, for example. I think those are interesting ways of playing. So I think that's pretty cool. I think that the better loot tables also helps newer players get into the game, because I think what would happen is like nobody wants to go grind the same dungeon when you're a brand new player. People want to go like explore and see what's new, rather than doing the same exact content just to like finally get one drop. So a lot of the drop tables have been improved for all of the dungeons. So I'm hoping to kind of keep that trend going with newer dungeons that I release as well. But I am kind of going back through the game with a little bit of a fine-tooth comb and trying to plan out the exact progression that will happen for a brand new player as they like kind of trek through every single biome. And it's not exactly where I want it right now, but it is kind of getting a little bit closer to that, I think. So that'll be like an ongoing work I think that I'll have to do, is keeping the game balanced for new players, but also making enough in-game content for like existing players who have done all of the early game content. Because some people have already basically done every single dungeon in the game many times. So obviously I want to make it fun for those types of people who are really good, but also make it fun for newer players who aren't as good or haven't played as much to learn the systems and things like that. For some reason, people love to scam in online games, and I haven't implemented trading yet. So what I did instead, because I do have, or what people would do is people would drop loot. So you'd be with your friend and you'd both like drop your item into the same loot bag, and then you just kind of trade that way. But obviously people can scam you that way. So what I did was I added these little islands down here, and one person would drop their loot over here, and then one person would drop their loot over here. So you're trading your coconut for your the health pot. And there's a setting inside of loot display where you can turn on loot to show up all the time, or whenever you hover over, you can also enable that. So it just shows when you hover your cursor over the loot bag. But let's turn it all the way on. So now you can drop your item, see that they drop what you expected them to, and then you guys can both run to the other side and claim your item. So this was my little my temporary workaround to hopefully solve it a little bit, but people still do it, I guess. I guess what people will do is they'll drop boots that look the same, or think like items that look kind of like the one, and then get scammed that way. Or someone will like wait over here in the middle, and then like someone will walk over and then they'll just run over there and like grab the item. Or some people won't even use the item or the little island thing, and they'll just drop it in like the town, and then someone will pick it up. So there's a lot of issues with that. So I do probably need to add trading here soon, just because it's such an issue, or it's becoming such an issue. And it's something that I can't reasonably handle on a case-by-case basis. I don't want people to have like a miserable time playing Mythfall, obviously, so I would like to solve this. It will take a little bit of work though, so it's not something I'll be able to solve immediately, but it is something that is on my list of things that I need to solve. But anyways, that's all I have for this week. As always, an absolutely massive thank you to all the supporters on YouTube, Twitch, GitHub, and Patreon. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.